Hello, this is John Holden in England. Greetings to everyone at Passion por la Pesca. I'm very sorry, but I can't speak Spanish, so I hope that someone will be able to translate this for you. I don't know very much about fishing in Chile or South America, but from what I've learned, you do things in a fairly similar way to what we do in England. In answering your questions, I want to tell you that I'm talking about practical fishing. If you want to be a tournament caster, the tackle and the techniques are very different from what you need on the beach. So let's concentrate purely on what we need to cast far enough to catch fish. Choosing the right tackle doesn't have to be difficult. You don't need to get too involved in technology. What you need is something that's easy to use, that will do the job that you need it to do, and everything has to be put together in an outfit that balances properly. By that I mean that your rod, reel, line and sinker all have to work well together, and they have to suit you. We're all different in shape and size and strength and how well we can cast, and it's very important you choose tackle that gets the best performance from yourself. Nearly everyone I know uses a rod about 13 feet long, and it's balanced to cast 150 grams of lead. But we find that with 150 grams of lead we get the best performance from ourselves and also from the fishing. Occasionally we get very rough weather, in which case we use a little bit more lead. We might use 170 grams or maybe even 200 grams on rare occasions. But when you're learning to cast, and for average day-to-day fishing, 150 grams is the one that we prefer. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the technicalities of this, but if you use a small sinker, you have to make it fly very fast to get your distance, and if you do that, there's a strong tendency to damage the baits. So we use a little bit more lead so that we get a slower cast that flies just as far, but it does a lot less bait damage. So we've got 150 grams of lead, a 4 metre rod, and then we're going to use a main line of about 0.35 millimetres in diameter, which in English terms is a breaking strain of about 15 pounds. On the front of that we use a shock leader to absorb the stress of casting, and for most people this will be somewhere around 50 to 60 pounds or approximately 25 kilos. Reels we use are almost always multiply reels, which some people call bait casters. Where we can, we use a small reel, and the most popular models would be the Abu Ambassador 6500 series or one of the Daiwa 7 series, such as the 7HT or the Turbo Mag. It probably doesn't matter what you use as long as you use a fairly small reel that doesn't have a level wind. That's very important. Level winds cause more trouble than anything, and they also make a great reduction in the distance you can cast. Now sometimes you need heavier line, in which case you'll need a bigger reel, and in England people would use the Penn 525 or perhaps one of the Daiwa SL SH series reels. Where we can, we use the small CTs because that gives us the distance, they're easier to cast, and for the kind of fishing we do here, they're perfectly adequate. Some people still use the spinning reel, or as we call them in England, the fixed spool. Despite what you may have heard about the difference between the two types of reels, a spinning reel will cast just as far as a bait caster, and in some circumstances it will cast even further. Let's focus on rods for a moment, particularly for the beginner. What you really need is a rod that you can bend easily. Doesn't mean a soft floppy rod, it means a rod that takes up a nice curve when you put in your maximum casting power. This is very important. If you cannot bend the rod properly, you will never be able to cast it well. That's one of the very fundamental things about casting. If you can't bend it, you can't cast it. It's as simple as that. In practical terms, you need a rod that has got a little bit of flexibility in the handle or in the lower half of the rod. Too many rods these days are very, very stiff in the handle. There's no flexibility at all. That is not a good way to cast if you're a beginner. It may suit the expert, but it will do you more harm than good when you're trying to learn a good technique. Now the upper half of the rod needs to be nicely flexible so that it's good for fishing, and if you're pendulum casting, the flexibility also helps you to control the swing of the lead. If you put the two together, the fairly flexible top and the fairly stiff but not rigid bottom end, you get what's called medium fast or fast taper. If you buy a rod of that design, about 4 meters long, and it says on the label that it's for casting say 100 to 200 grams of lead, that's going to be fine. Don't try to buy a tournament rod or a very powerful fishing rod at this point. When you're a beginner, you need a good basic rod. What I'm saying here is that it's too easy to become involved with technology. If you do that, you're going to spend a lot of money, and quite honestly, you may get no benefits from it at all. That's not always the case. Sometimes a different rod will help you, but now we're focusing on beginners. We need to keep a good sense of perspective. Keep it simple. A well-balanced outfit used with a good technique needs very little tuning. If, for example, the reel explodes every cast and you get a mighty backlash of line, what that's really telling you is that your technique is wrong. So here's something to think about. If you can't control a multiplier reel and you are using a balanced outfit, then the problem is your technique. No amount of tuning will solve that problem. There's only one way to do it, and that's the obvious one of learning to cast better. Let's set up the outfit and get it ready for learning to cast. First step is to fill the reel with line. Now in the case of a small reel such as the Daiwa 7HT, you fill it with 0.35mm line, and the trick here is to make sure that the line goes on evenly. You need a nice level filling of line, and what you mustn't do is overload the reel. Fill it to within about 3mm of the edge of the spool. That may not be enough later on, but to begin with it will help you to cast. The next step is to put the reel into basic braking adjustment. Now with something like a 7HT where you've only got centrifugal brake blocks, put in 2 large blocks. Then adjust the side play on the spool using the end caps so that you can just feel a little bit of movement across the frame. That ensures that the spool runs freely. Now in passing I'll mention the business of lubrication and bearings. I have never ever used special bearings in any of my reels, and that includes the time that I was tournament casting. The ceramic bearings and things that you can buy these days are very good. They make the reel run smoothly, they make it quieter, they probably do last a bit longer than the standard bearings, and yes, they can increase your distances a little bit. But whether you will see that advantage on the beach, I doubt it. On a tournament field, yes, there will be a difference, and if you ever get into tournament casting, then you'll need to take all these things into account, because quite often the difference between winning and losing is only a couple of meters. All I use is plain machine oil. That's very thin oil. You can even use the engine oil from an automobile. Just a couple of drops in each bearing and that's the job done. With the rod and reel together and the line on the spool, I then fit the shock leader. And I adjust the length of the shock leader so that when I'm ready to cast, there are always no less than 6 turns of heavy line on the spool. That's for safety. Any less and you may not get the protection of the shock leader because the knot will slip and break. The length of drop, that is the distance between the rod tip and the sinker, will vary according to the design of the rod and to the way you cast. Almost always it's